Hello guys and welcome back to new video here on Mickey Reaction. If you are new here, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. And now, let's get started.
When I moved away from home, I promised my family it would just be for 1 year. Then I'd be back. Pretty soon though, 1 year turned into 10 years. And I think my family gave up all hope that I'd ever return. Obviously, we grew apart during that time, but I still sent them half my salary every single month. And we spoke on the phone when we could. Usually they'd send me excited voices notes when they received my money, but a few months passed where I didn't hear a peep from them. Just the occasional thumbs up emoji. I started to get worried and decided to fly home and surprise them. It was long overdue. You see, I'd been working as a maid for a super rich family, and not once had they let me take a holiday. I lied and told them that my dad was sick and that I needed to rush home. For all I knew, that could even be true. I expected them to tell me to go straight away, but instead they told me I couldn't leave, and that if I dared to, they'd fire me. So, I got fired. They gave me 1 hour to pack up all my stuff, say bye to the kids, and get out. I couldn't believe it. After everything I'd done for them, well, now I was even more excited to get home to my family, who loved me dearly. I used up the last of my savings to buy the plane ticket, but I knew once I got home I could live with my parents and they would take care of me, just like I'd taken care of them for all these years. Except when the taxi pulled up outside my parents' address, something didn't seem right. My dad loved gardening, but the garden looked like a wreck. Panic shot through my body. Something must have happened to him. I ignored the mess and rushed to the front door and started knocking. I knew no one was in because the house was in darkness. I decided to just try the door in the hope that it would open, and wow, it actually was. I walked right in, and I'm not joking, it smelled like someone had died in there. I covered my nose and ran into the other two rooms in the house, but the place was deserted. Then I heard a shuffling sound, and my heart froze. My parents were still here after all. I turned around and said, "Surprise, I'm home!" Except instead of seeing my parents standing there, I was face to face with a huge, hairy guy, and he looked more shocked than me. I screamed and asked what he was doing in my house. And before I could say anything more, he started running. "Hey, I'll call the police!" I screamed, and that got him. He stopped running and came back up the path. Then he laughed and said, "Ain't nobody lived here a month, sweetie. I moved in when I saw the place was deserted. Finders keepers, right?" I couldn't believe it. Where were my parents? I had a really bad feeling. Had they just abandoned me?
This is so
I looked around the room and noticed there were some envelopes lying on the table. They had my handwriting on them, and they were empty. The guy saw me looking at them and said someone had been sending money to the house, and how sweet it was of them. This couldn't be happening. I had to get to the police. My parents could be in danger, or worse, they could be dead. The guy said he had to go run an errand, and I don't know why, but I decided to look around, just to make sure my parents weren't tied up somewhere. Clearly, I'd been watching too many horror movies. The place was filthy, but seeing as I'd spent the last 10 years as a maid, I got to work and started cleaning the place. Hours later, the guy came back, and as soon as he was inside, I asked him what he knew. He said he'd never even seen my parents, and that this place had been empty when he moved in. I didn't believe him at all. He looked scared and pulled out his phone to call the police. "Hey, that's my dad's phone!" I shouted at him. Then he looked at me and said, well, it was here when I moved in, so I just sort of claimed it." But I didn't understand. Why had he been replying to me then? I asked him about the thumbs up emojis, and he said he was just being polite. And then he said, "Oh, so you're Anna then. Thanks for the money, doll. You've been a real help. We call you Anna the Angel around here. Very sweet of you." This was too much. I tried calling my mom's number, and suddenly I heard a phone ringing. "Oh, I didn't think Margot was here," the hairy guy said. Then he dug around in a sleeping bag and pulled out my mom's phone. I gave up. I'd just have to go to the police. I was too scared to call them in front of this guy, so I told him I'd go try to find my parents and I'd pop back around soon. I ran out of there with my suitcase, and then I called the police, who said they'd be right over. I decided I'd go speak to the neighbors in the meantime, see if anyone remembered me, and could tell me anything about my parents. But there was no one around. In fact, it looked like a ghost street. Had everyone just moved out? I remembered my parents had mentioned they might move because there were rumors all the houses here were going to be torn down. Well, maybe that was what had happened.
Yeah,
Maybe they just moved? The police arrived 30 minutes later, and they went into the house to have a word with the hairy guy. After a while, they came back out and said this whole neighborhood was due to be torn down any week now, so those squatters could do whatever they liked. "But it's my house," I said. The policeman looked bored and said I could come down to the station and file a proper report. The whole time I was freaking out, though. Why wouldn't my parents tell me if they moved? This made no sense. When we got to the station, I told them my name. They typed something into their computer and looked up at me, confused. "Sorry, ma'am, but it says here you live abroad?" Duh, but I was back now, and I didn't have time for this. I asked them to at least help me find my parents, and when I gave their names, they said they'd left the country a couple of months ago, and therefore they couldn't help me. I made quite a scene, and eventually they asked me to leave or they'd have to call the chief police officer. I'd been gone so long, I didn't know what to do. My parents could be anywhere by now. And why hadn't they told me they were going traveling?
I don't know.
I felt kind of annoyed. They should have been using the money I sent to look after the house, not go traveling. No wonder the house looked horrible. I walked the streets for a bit before finding a little cafe. I was starving and exhausted, so I flopped into a seat by the window and just ordered coffee after coffee while I tried to figure out what to do. Eventually, the manager came over to me and said they were closing soon. I drank up and was getting ready to leave when I heard someone screaming. I looked outside and there was an old woman by the window, staring and pointing at me. I quickly went out to see if she was okay, and she started praying and shaking her head. "The ghost of Anna is here. Oh, Lord, why?" She kept muttering to herself over and over again. And then I recognized her. It was my grandma's best friend. My grandma had died when I was little, so we'd lost touch with her over the years. I tried to calm her down and told her I wasn't a ghost, that I was alive, and I needed her help. We found a nearby bench, and she was honestly shaking. I told her I'd been living abroad and had just come home because I hadn't heard from my parents in ages. She then told me that she'd seen my parents about 2 months ago, and they'd been hysterical, saying I'd died. So they'd left to go and collect my body. She said no one had seen or heard from them since, but that there had been a rumor going around that they'd decided to stay abroad because they were too sad to come home without me. This was crazy. I was clearly alive. Why would my parents think I died? But why did they think I was dead when I was messaging them this whole time? I asked her. And the old lady looked at me and said, "Your boss sent a letter to them saying that there had been some kind of accident and you sadly passed away." No! Why would my boss do that? I mean, he didn't treat me that well, but he wasn't cruel. I didn't get it. I needed to call my boss and ask him about this. He didn't pick up, though. I tried dozens of times, but he just ignored me. What did I expect? He'd fired me. Suddenly, things started to make more sense. The way my boss had been so quick to fire me and told me not to bother coming back. Why had I let him treat me like that? But to tell my parents I died? That was too much. He could go to prison for this. I left the old lady and ran back to the police station. I told them the whole story, and then I gave them my boss's number and asked if they could call him to see if my parents had been in touch with him. They could see I was getting frantic, and finally they started to take me seriously. The chief assured me that they'd do some investigating, and then I gave them my number and hurried back to my parents' house. I wanted to ask the hairy guy some more questions. As I ran home, I couldn't stop thinking about my boss. How could he do this? My poor parents. From a distance, I noticed the hairy guy was sitting outside with a woman who I assumed was Margot. Luckily, it was dark by then, so I managed to walk along without being seen. They were chatting quite loudly, and what they said shook me to my core. To be honest, I ain't sure she believed what I was saying about us being squatters. What if she figures out her parents left the country because they thought she died? We need to get on the run again. Maybe we can try our luck again in the next town. Then Margot laughed and said, "I can't believe they fell for it. It was too easy, wasn't it? Let's just pack up quickly and get out of here before the police get onto us." I couldn't believe it. So they'd done this. Not my boss. They were criminals. Why would they do this? I was too scared to confront them, so I quickly called the police and asked them to come to my parents' address. They arrived just in time. The hairy guy and Margot were almost all packed up and were heading out to an old beat-up car which I recognized as my dad's old car. Of course. Well, they didn't make it any further than the garden path before the police arrested them. They'd called my old boss, and of course he'd known nothing about this and hadn't seen my parents. I needed to find them. But before that, I got to watch the police arrest the hairy guy and that Margot woman. They kept shouting at
Oh,
me, but
yeah.
I just stood there, grinning. I hope they got locked up for the rest of their lives. I wanted to beat
I
myself
wish that
up over the
too.
fact that I left to surprise my parents. But at the same time, thank God I did, because otherwise, who knows what those criminals would have done next.
Oh, yeah.
As it turns out, my parents weren't their first victims. They'd done this to 3 other families. Well,
Oh my
I'd put
God.
an end to that. And it didn't take long to track down my parents. Once the police here alerted the police over there, they managed to find them. They were staying in some kind of homeless shelter because they'd run out of money and couldn't afford to fly home. When I called them, they didn't believe it was me. They just kept screaming, and I told them I was safe at home and that I was going to buy their ticket so they could come back. I have never been more happy to see my parents in my entire life. When I saw them walking through the arrivals gate, I just broke down into tears. I thought I'd been through hell, but from the looks of them, who'd thought they'd lost their daughter, they looked completely broken. It was
Oh,
a
yeah.
pretty emotional reunion, and not what I'd expected when I'd flown back
This is
2 days
so
before.
emotional.
They filled me in on all the details, how their house had been robbed, all their money and phones gone, and a day
Oh
later how
my
they'd
God.
received a letter saying I died. They'd even had to borrow money to fly to bring my body back. What a crazy twist of events. But at least we're all alive and finally back in the same place again. I don't plan on leaving them ever again.
Alright guys, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Bye bye.